Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks, Peter, for inviting me. As a matter of fact, really thanks for putting this on. World Malaria Day doesn't get seen and attended by everybody. I had to explain it at work, not in the President's Malaria Initiative, but over at USAID that, by the way, this was that day and they should pay attention. So thank you for putting this together and thank you all for coming. I actually probably should have titled this Zero Malaria Starts With Me, or perhaps with us. And to that extent, let me first of all ask, how many of you were bitten by a mosquito last night? And how many of you slept under a bed net last night? So that's a testimony to the fact that you still care, even though you perceive that you individually have no risk. And thank you for that, because that's really important to the wider community. We've been asked to talk about elimination in sub-Saharan Africa, and one point that I'd just like to be clear is that there has been no such thing in an endemic sub-Saharan African nation, and thus our knowledge gap and the challenges we face must be all-encompassing. I'm going to talk a little bit about history and progress, probably use a few slides you've seen already. That's the risk of doing an afternoon keynote as opposed to first thing. Talk a little bit about people, because that's the Zero Malaria begins with me, or with us. A little bit about speed of change and maybe the battle and the strategy. So this is that recent history, and you've heard a little bit of this morning. Larry talked about the Global Malaria Eradication Program, 50s and 60s. That was followed by a move into control, and that was actually fairly formally declared, maybe a little late, but essentially the 30 years from the 70s through the 90s was a period of sub-Saharan Africa malaria control. If you remember, Rollback Malaria Partnership was constituted in December of 1998 with WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank, and UNDP, plus many partner countries and partner organizations. I raise that because, to be honest, in terms of the we and the us in this, we don't really have that much engagement with UNDP. The World Bank made substantial investments early on, but at this juncture, there's not a systematic program for grants or loans to countries for their malaria control programs. And UNICEF, while they're still very much in the business of maternal and child health, don't necessarily put malaria in front of us on a regular basis. So as Clive was asking Kim earlier about, why doesn't WHO have more resources? I just point out to all of us, in terms of thinking about our advocacy, it's not WHO doesn't have enough resources. We actually, across our UN agencies, maybe need to pay some more attention. Okay, so that happened in 1998, and then funding started to emerge in 2003 to 2006. Global Fund was created. The World Bank developed its World Bank Booster Program, which provided its substantial grants and loans to, in particular, to sub-Saharan African countries. The US President's Malaria Initiative was constituted in 2005 and sort of technically began in 2006. And Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation began substantial investment, particularly in the science and the research side of things, but not only. And indeed, it was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2007 that we put elimination/eradication back on the table. And for those of you who were in that room at that time, I happen to be lucky to be so. Lucky because it was fascinating to watch the community sit there and and a bunch of them sort of looking at each other going, really? Are we there yet? We just got a little bit of money on the table. This is all very, very new, and all of a sudden we're talking about progress and moving this forward. So that's history. That goes back to the 50s, but when you think about this more recently, it's really, since it's a 21st century process. This is not very old. And to give you a sense of that from the President's Malaria Initiative standpoint, we started out with country engagement in 2006, and we have expanded that through to today, where we began with 3 countries and $30 million from Congress, and we're now in 27 countries with about $730 million. So there has been substantial build on this front, and a similar, not exactly the same way, but a similar growth in the Global Fund and their investment in malaria. And the combination of those two makes up the biggest part of the investment going on out there. And indeed, in progress, these are numbers by country for all-cause child mortality. This is data that is presented by the President's Malaria Initiative, knowing full well that we contributed. It's not attributed to us, but we feel proud that we've actually, as part of the US government's investment in this, that there has been really substantial progress around the globe, or around the continent of Africa. And as Kim pointed out, this slide is showing WHO estimates from 2000 to 2015 as to the number of countries that have fewer than 10 cases, fewer than 100 cases, or fewer than 1,000 cases of malaria. And that's been growing essentially every year over that interval. And this is the remarkable nature of a number of countries moving forward. That speed of that growth is actually a bit in contrast to this. So this is one of those wonderful slides that you never want to put up in front of people because it's got way too many numbers. So it's Mesoamerica and all of the countries over here, and highlighting El Salvador. And I do that because El Salvador in 1980 had 95,835 confirmed cases, and then in subsequent 5-year intervals, cut that in half, cut it again by 5, cut it by 3, cut it by whatever that division is, and then most recently reported 0 in 2018. So that started in 1980, and it took that long to get down from less than 100,000 cases to get to 0. So it's daunting, and this is Mesoamerica, which is purportedly in better economic shape than a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. So the speed at which some of this happens when you try to go for elimination is a cautionary note. So you've seen these maps. This was back in 2000, and thanks to the Malaria Atlas Project. This is in 2006 when essentially the work with PMI began, and there wasn't much difference between 2000 and 2006 in terms of that belt across all of sub-Saharan Africa. But as you go to 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, more recently, it's really dropped a lot. And you all know this, but it's still, to me, impressive to see that. And then when in the midst of this, some of what happens is that you start we look at where PMI is involved, and as was pointed out earlier, it's involved in every one of these high burden countries that have been called out most recently by WHO. At the same time, over here in Senegal, it's all blue, and it didn't used to be. And in southern Africa, across a number of countries, it's nearly all blue, didn't all used to be. East Africa is more all blue than it used to be, and Madagascar looks a little better than it used to be. So back to Kim's point earlier this morning about whether or not you try to go to the center and to the worst places, or you sit on the edges and try to work with those places that have done well, let me suggest that there's probably a mix. So maybe one key thought that I'd let you ponder going upon leaving this room is, how important would it be if we got one of these countries malaria-free in sub-Saharan Africa? Would that change people's attention and people's wanting to be part of success for the next country and the next country after that? So I circle those not to say that those are the right places, but then to ask, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, about political will. Because the difference between being blue and being gray, which is free of malaria, we've said that that's going to require country engagement and country involvement to drive it all the way down. And so picking amongst those circled countries as to which ones look like they've got the infrastructure, the leadership, the long-term commitment to make that happen might be the place to go. And lastly, I probably wouldn't choose just one, because history says that choosing just one can be trouble. So back to the malaria starts with me. I think this is all about people, and this is probably the wonderful thing about working in this field, because you get a chance to help this woman and her children in Ethiopia. Or you get to sit with this women in a community group in Uganda. Or you get to spend time with folks in Zanzibar looking hard at their data. They don't have much in the way of cases, so it's really important that they look hard at the ones they do have. Or teaching somebody how to use a rapid diagnostic test. Or lining up and training people how to spray. But what's really important and really fun is the fact that this next generation is learning from the current generation. It doesn't get better than this. So there are some challenges for our elimination. And first of all, others have spoken to a lot of these key points, and they've had a chance to talk in more depth. I think as a keynote speaker, you're not supposed to talk in great depth. You're supposed to be sort of, but then to compensate for that, they give you more time. So they've spoken already to the biology, ecology, to some of the new tools, to some of the new and old strategies that were, and I say new and old because sometimes we have to revive those which we cast aside in past years. I've brought up the issue of resourcing, and we have a tendency to talk about money, but I think that the real investment, and that's the nice thing about this, this year's World Malaria Day mantra, of it starting with me or with us, that it will be about us in this room, about the people we know in the countries, and about the generation that they will need to be training. And so I know everybody talks about our commitment to training the next generation. And when you get sort of 30 plus years in the field, you're part of the group that's no longer the next generation. You're the one that should actually be empowering the next group. This is really, really important. So between the people and the education sits the money. We hope that we can figure out how to generate that. Unfortunately, I don't know everybody in this room, obviously, but I would suspect that most of us are wanting to be the receivers of additional resources as opposed to have it in our pockets to be giving out. But that said, we're all part and parcel of influencing this on the basis of our good work. It's also possible that we're part of the challenge. We as a human race tend to have a pretty short attention span. And all due respect, some of the pressures on us over the recent years have actually shortened that attention span, because it's got to be new and shiny, or it's old and tired, and we're not interested anymore. We're not perfect in our vision, our balance, and our consistency. We can all work on that. In the science community, much of which is assembled here, we are meant to be hard questioners. And I'm not suggesting that we drop the hard questioning in the midst of this. But from time to time, it's okay to let things go forward and then learn about them, as opposed to kind of keep them off on the sides because we're not sure. And then we've talked about this political commitment, or also known as political will. And I guess that that's the contrast to political won't, or to political maybe. Most of you aren't old enough to remember the Smothers Brothers. This was a music group back in the 60s that got on television and ended up playing music and reading poetry. And I don't know why I remember this, but as a kid, listening to them and thinking that they were pretty cool. They got kicked off the air. They had to be really cool. They had this poem which said, "Should I write a letter to my congressman? A congressman has a sitting end and a thinking end. And since his or her success depends upon his or her seat, should I bother?" Actually, you should bother, because they could be a political maybe, and you want them to have political will. There are some political won'ts out there. There are the countries in conflict, and I would argue that that's a political won't, because it's really hard to work in that environment. It's hard to get long-term commitment. And as a matter of fact, somebody in that country is wanting there to be no commitment. That is, that leader should be gone. That's a really hard place to eliminate, I suspect. And I'll reflect on, on some of the discussion from Zambia. People don't talk about it very much, but the political will in Zambia has been something that's been carried across. At least I've witnessed 5 different presidential elections there. The permanent secretary is meant to be permanent. They're not actually permanent. But with each replacement of a permanent secretary, they've had continued emphasis and follow-on. With the 6 ministers of health that I've met and known, they've all been committed. And it's a country with gradual, slow economic progress and a stable government that has allowed the program to be incredibly forceful in moving things forward. So we've got a lot of, one thing I'd like to point out is, so Kim mentioned the global technical strategy, or somebody did this morning. There's an action and investment to defeat malaria, which was a companion document produced through the Rollback Malaria Partnership. We have the malaria research agenda for the elimination research. We have an update of that more recently. And somewhere in the middle of that came a framework for malaria elimination. I've had the pleasure of being able to read through these and contribute to some of them. And as I look at them, there is nothing that is particularly wrong in any of those. It's not like we're sitting with bad ideas or with having covered most of the bases. I just wanted to talk about, I mentioned in the title, the steps to elimination. I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because we don't, in the process of generating it, we had this strategic framework on the left, and we had and developed for that middle document, the framework for malaria elimination. We recognized that when we did that, it's almost unreadable and unintelligible. So first of all, on the technical strategy, on the left-hand side of the framework is just the technical strategy turned sideways, just to point that out. So all we did was take the strategy and flip it sideways. So it's got the 3 pillars of pushing forward with universal coverage of prevention and case management. It's got the acceleration efforts, and it's got the information systems. It's also got the supporting element that includes harnessing innovation and research, and of strengthening the enabling environment. And then we put on what are called components here. It was actually comes from something where in Zambia it was called steps. But to go through those, let me first point out that what we did was we put a transmission intensity piece across the top. And we did that in an effort to link and not make breaks in control versus elimination, or pre-elimination and elimination, but to recognize that most countries were actually in a process of moving forward. And that was their goal, and to get to 0 or to get to no deaths and no cases was just a steady progress. So it's possible to put numbers there. I will tell you that some of the early documents, and I was involved in this, so I take full responsibility for screwing that up, and try and fix it here, which is to say, let's think about this in terms of order of magnitude of transmission reduction. And that if you start out with 1,000, an API of 1,000, so 1,000 cases per year per 1,000 population, everybody's infected once on average this year. In order to get to moderate, you have to drop that to 100, or 10-fold reduction. You next can drop it to 10, to 1, and to 0. Okay, well, let's say it wasn't 1,000. Let's say it was 300. We go to 30, to 3, to 0.3, to 0. And I just suggest to you that 0.3 and 1 aren't a lot different from each other. And 0 is the same. So when you get to the right-hand side, there is an element of this that means that it doesn't matter where you started. You've still got to go, count them 1, 2, 3, plus orders of magnitude down. And the bottom line is that cases at facilities and in the community start out at way too many. They drop, but they're still many. And then they get to some and to very low and finally to 0. And it really does become this issue of how are the health workers handling the situation. And lest you worry that the high burden, that is the deaths and the too many cases, isn't addressed by this, I'll just suggest that when there are too many cases, the morbidity and mortality are both high. And then you drop that, and you can actually probably drop deaths a little faster than you drop cases. And then you drop deaths a whole lot, and cases a whole lot, and you get down to very few. So there is an element of this which is trying to track something that is common. Next, I'd suggest to you that regardless of which country you're in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a pretty good chance that the transmission intensity within that country spans a fairly big distance. That is, some places are still at high, other places are at moderate, maybe low, maybe very low. Maybe there are places where there's no malaria. And there's still places where there's a moderate amount of malaria. So the steps. This is meant to be pretty straightforward and simple. It's the pillars. That is, the first one is ensuring universal access to malaria prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. So it's got all about vector control and diagnosis and treatment of cases. The increasing density of the line on that and those arrows are meant to suggest that there are points where you want to accelerate your quality of that service and the coverage level you achieve and the use that you achieve through the population. And it may be out at the very end that you could back off on a little bit of vector control when you're at 0. Maybe. So component B is about the information system. So that's taking malaria surveillance and turning it into a core intervention is one way of saying it. We're starting out in some countries that still don't have very good quality information on confirmed cases. Thus the lighter shade on the left. And the better they get, or the better they get in terms of reducing transmission, the more information they have to have on their cases. And then we put in C, which has to do with accelerating the efforts. And so this is a hard question as to whether or not acceleration and the speed at which you could do that is helpful. But certainly we've started to look at population-wide drug administration, at introducing chemoprevention in some places to see whether or not that would work. And as we know, there's vaccine going in and seeing if some of that might help, either now or in the future. And then lastly, what was known as step D in Zambia was this idea that you get down to very few cases and you need to investigate them, look for other cases around them, source and spread, and figure out how to shut down those foci. Sometimes that's just the household. So if you're sitting in a high transmission area, your job is to work on vector control, case management, and information. As you move over and you've gotten some success, arguably this is where that success that you got now needs actually to be looking for some additional acceleration to really make sure that you're getting better and better quality of services across the board. And it's only when you get to low or very low can you actually invoke the case investigation process. And unfortunately, the only thing you get to drop when you get over to 0, at least initially, is you don't necessarily have to go back into those populations to get the accelerator anymore. But you got to do everything else and be capable of doing that to get certified. So that's just to take one table and try and explain it. So some of that is, so I mentioned the idea of acceleration, and we have this issue of speed of change. And you've seen these lines where countries' cases come down and then they just kind of keep on going. The drops tend to be fairly fast. And anticipating that is something that we may not have been all that great at doing. And hopefully, as we watch it happen in repeated places, we get better at it. The slow change, this process of what you have to do when you've got very few cases and you're struggling because there's reintroduction, we heard about population movement, you've got some resistance developing with your insecticides, and you've got to replace those with better vector control, et cetera, that tends to be this difficult process going over time. So just to look at that briefly, so this, I highlighted Senegal here on this 2015 map. And this is what happened in Senegal in terms of cases from 2000 out to 2016. And this is this point of saying that there was a rapid reduction Arguably, for some who have followed this, some of that was using rapid diagnostic tests and getting the fever cases not counted anymore. But some of it was actually quite real. And then they've been struggling with that blip going down. It would be nice if that were the only, well, it wouldn't be nice if that's the only thing you have to look at. Because the other thing you have to look at is this notion that the country isn't in one place on the transmission line. That is, the red areas in the southeast have a lot of malaria, and those in the north and west side of the country have actually very little. So those go from an API of 1 to an API above 300. So Senegal is that microcosm of all of Africa. And they've got to figure out what to do in Senegal. And I just suggest to you that that's actually true in just about every country. And while we might want to blur the boundaries and think about the transmission that's going on between boundaries, we actually are living this district by district in a place like Senegal, where they've faced with that same diversity of transmission. And what they do in the red area is now not what they're doing in the green area, or vice versa. And this just is meant to drive it home a little bit further. So these are number of districts, population, cases of malaria, cases of serious malaria, deaths tied to malaria, deaths in children under 5, and an incidence per strata. Over on the far right are those red areas. They make up 32% of the district, so only 1/3 of the country is over there. 30% of the population, but 85% of all of the cases in the country. And so they have 300,000 cases in those 24 districts, and that's compared to a total of 50,000 in the, whatever that is, 52 districts that have lower levels. They've got 64% of the serious cases, 70% of the deaths, 85% of the deaths in children under 5. So just to point out that while we want to think about sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately it's country by country, and they've all got this kind of diversity, or many of them do. So lastly, we've talked about malaria as a fight against the parasite and the mosquito. Luckily for us, there's not a lot of stigma in this. We can, killing those mosquitoes, there's no mosquito advocacy group that has emerged to date. But the battle requires that we've got good tools, so we need to be well armed. And then there's the issue of the strategy. So I found this wonderful photo in an army camp where they're clearly at battle and they've got a loaded rifle out there, but they're working on the strategy game and they're all playing chess. So none of you slept under nets last night, none of you had mosquito bites. How many of you have played chess? Okay. Any chess masters in the... So chess to me is a fascinating game. There's the opening gambit. So the opening gambit means that I'm going to play the first 5 to 8 moves exactly the same no matter what my opponent does. That's a bit like putting out your vector control and your case management and setting up your information system. There's a middle game. In the middle game, you've started to make choices. You're trying to seek advantage. Sometimes you make sacrifices to do so. There are books still about the middle game. So there are a lot of books about the opening gambits, and there are a lot of opening gambits. Some of them are pretty wild. But the middle game, there are also some books about how to play that and how to seek advantage. There's the issue of playing against the clock, if you've ever been in a tournament. So it turns out when you make your move, you punch the clock with the hand that made the move. Okay, you can't do this, kind of cheat a little bit. Because when your clock runs out, you actually lose. So you have to finish the game before your clock runs out. And if your opponent's clock runs out, they lose. So we do have a time frame on this. And then there's the end game. So the end game, actually, there may be a book about the end game, but it's really kind of out there. You're on your own. It's going to look different every time depending upon how many pawns you have in the game, what's left. And you got to go for checkmate, because elimination doesn't work as a draw. So I enjoy playing games. Our work needs to be fun. The strategies need to be appreciated. Arguably, it's okay to be doing different things in that end game in different countries. We've still got a ways to go in sub-Saharan Africa before we get there. But we can do it. The cool thing about chess is that the tournaments are huge. And that's the next generation. Those are all kids playing that game. And this is a bit like what's going on district by district. Every once in a while, we look to get that real whiz kid who can go up against the old fogies and come up with something new and beat them all. And so for those of you working on those tools, I heard that somebody wanted to move those mosquitoes that can't transmit parasites into populations, and that would be a really nice idea. So we clearly want these kids or these young folks coming through and getting us better ideas. And just to challenge Larry, because he got us a designer, I found this in that we've made it big time in terms of our interventions, and we now have made it to El Decor. Thank you very much.
Other questions for Dr. Steketee?
Post-lunch.
Yeah. I mean, maybe Rick,
Question for Tom Wellens, NIH. The question of MDA and the first step on the slide, I didn't see that there. And I wonder what your thoughts are. The mass drug administration, bring malaria down rapidly, eliminate a large source out of asymptomatic elder children and adults, and then proceed with the subsequent steps that you outlined.
Rick, maybe if you could repeat the question.
So Tom Wellens at NIH is asking about the mass drug administration and where it is on the table. It's actually step C, or component C. That's the accelerator process of one of the options for clearing parasites from humans, as you're pointing out, and moving on. And you're right, at least in terms of my opinion. That is, that it's not something that's going to be easy to do repeatedly year in and year out. But if we can actually make a big push for it, because everything else is in place in order to make the gains that you achieve with that, sustained over time through your other interventions, then that could be really helpful.
I think Dave's going to ask a question. Oh, and this one here. Sorry. Is it on?
Speak loud. David Smith from the University of Washington. I'm going to ask a question about money. So it's been I've been a student of malaria now for a long time, and I was surprised when the IRS that got implemented in Tororo, where we happened to be working, knocked malaria down from annual EIRs of about 300 down to nothing. And it seems to be that when IRS is done very well, as it has been in some places in Uganda, that you take malaria down to zero. And so there's a good case to be made for scaling it up, right? And there are about 15 districts out of 90. So ballpark, if you could increase the budgets in Uganda by a factor of 6, you could come close to eliminating malaria across Uganda. So it's a fairly simple and straightforward argument. We can put it in fancy language. We can put numbers around it. But the fact is, the numbers kind of speak for themselves, and yet there isn't a big push to increase the budgets for Uganda by 6-fold. And the question I have for you is, if we're serious about elimination and eradication, how do we make the case? Where do we go? Which congressman do we call and harangue to get a 6-fold increase in the budgets so that we can take care of a place like Uganda? Thanks.
Yeah, and Dave, that's sort of the question everybody wants to know the answer to. It's not which congressman you go to make the point, but how do you make the case that this is value? The way the case is best made, as I've been watching it, is on 2 fronts. One is about the return on that investment, whether it's in economic terms, in social, cultural terms, et cetera. Unless you can voice that with clarity and hopefully with some evidence behind it, you don't get very far, because so the other side of this is who else is in on this with me? So if I'm the US Congress and I'm going to give money, where else is it coming from? Is the country contributing? So the good news is you've inherited a lot of money from your rich uncle, and you're willing to talk to your congressman about the investment you want to make and what's the congressman going to do. But frequently it's a negotiation on a balanced partner investment. So one of the things to point out, I'll just say that from President's Malaria Initiative standpoint, we're working very hard with other funders to look at our combined effort and make the case as a combined effort. And to do that with the countries themselves. So Zambia is a great example of a country that has put forward its own money from its Ministry of Finance and negotiated that to get that out there. They're actually buying that insecticide for indoor residual spraying with their own money. So some of the balance of this investment is really nicely done if it's with partners. And that's the experience. And if we can make mosquitoes resistant to parasites, maybe we can get trees that grow dollar bills or something. But I haven't seen it yet.
Hi, April Monroe from Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs and PMI VectorWorks project. Thank you so much for the nice presentation. It was very interesting. You mentioned the need for new tools as well as remembering some old effective strategies to get to malaria elimination. Could you say more about, from PMI's perspective, what's most promising moving forward? Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things that I would suggest that PMI has worked hard on, and as you saw, we've gone from 3 countries to 27 countries. So there's been a larger effort of expanding the breadth of the work, working in the high transmission areas as that, and being consistent about that. So I would argue that some of the strongest value we have is that you know what we're going to do next year too. And that's good because people can start to plan on that basis. So we don't have a lot of new things that we do and introduce necessarily. That said, we are in the midst of looking at new nets because we've got way too much insecticide resistance and we've got new opportunities available to us today. The issue of spraying and mixing the spraying with the nets is another intervention approach that we've indeed embraced. Not everywhere, but where transmission is really high, if we can't get a new net there, we can probably get a new insecticide on the wall sprayed. So this is some of the balance of the struggle against the vector. So.
Toby Lehman, NIH. I wonder about something that nags me in the course of this series of talks. I am hearing about no spatial scales of where the countries are not clear units. The districts are not units of transmission. You could be very effective in a particular district or a particular country. We already heard about the issue of reintroduction, but what is the coordination necessary? Because there is a huge loss of investment, possibly, if this is a concern that is shared. I also believe that some of the great success stories in the past, Soper in Brazil and others, have to do with their blanketing the whole area from edge to edge. And I would like to hear about that. Thank you.
Okay. No, thanks, Toby. There's a balance here. That is, we know that the ecosystem that is transmitting malaria doesn't start and stop at district borders. However, the administrative responsibility of the people in that district do start and stop at that border. So because we work with people, we have to appreciate that, we have to value that, and respect that. So this is why then when it's covering multiple districts, obviously the best thing to do is to try to get all of those districts working in the same common fashion. And an example is that, and this is a cross-border issue, in Senegal and Gambia in next week or the week after next, they're launching insecticide-treated net distribution program on both sides of the border simultaneously. So people do talk to each other, and every place we get that right, it's a whole lot better. So, but your point's well taken.
Rick, I'm going to ask you the last question, if I may, and picking up a theme from your talk. We have a lot of students in the audience, and if you could speak to them kind of directly about the future of a career in malaria and what they should focus on. Do they still have a career, or is this disease going to go away in time?
Please don't leave us. No, I think if there's one thing that you should be reassured about, it's that there's going to be malaria here for a while. And those of you who do have really rich uncles or aunts or whatever and want to help contribute, we can maybe get that to go away faster. But one of the things that to me is fun is that there is a combination, and I'd turn to Elizabeth and have you talk with Elizabeth afterwards as well. There is just as much an interest in the countries for training of their people to be able to do this. So some of the huge value that is out there, or the huge opportunity that's out there, is a combined process of getting training for both endemic country people and people in the global environment in order and make that connection work at the outset, that is during that initial training, so that the connectivity can last a career. Because that's what will be fun to you. On the personal side, I got into this business sort of backdoorish. That is, I had an opportunity to travel to Africa and do some healthcare work there. And I realized that I was seeing diseases that I hadn't seen before, and that was interesting. But what was really interesting was understanding people in a different culture and in a different environment. So if you don't like that, maybe you should find another profession. But if that is of interest, this is about as good as it gets in terms of meeting people from really diverse communities, diverse cultures, with incredible families and incredible stories. And if you can bring that to them and they can bring it to you, that can be really valuable.